You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed, and today we are joined by Mohammad Fadel. He's a full professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. And I've invited Professor Fadel to speak about Canada's response to the ICJ, to get his views on the ICJ, and more broadly talk about the implications of the ICJ on the Palestinian issue. Welcome to the show, Professor Fadel.
Thank you very much.
So let's begin, if we may, just get your thoughts on that. I mean, you published an article recently following the ICJ decision on Israel, on the South Africa case. Can I just get your thoughts on the ICJ and your response as a lawyer, professor of law, what you made of the decision?
Well, I think the decision was very significant. It found that the allegations that South Africa was making as a matter of law fell within the domain of the Genocide Convention, right? And then it found, as a matter of fact, that the factual predicate that South Africa advanced in the complaint was sufficient to justify a conclusion, a legal conclusion, that there was a substantial risk that the Palestinians in Gaza were facing an imminent risk of genocide. And so accordingly, that justified the court issuing provisional measures. In other words, what they're saying is that the risk of genocide is substantially high enough that the world needs to intervene. Because the way the Genocide Convention works is it's not simply an international agreement that authorizes or even requires the prevention of the punishment of genocide after the fact. It actually requires states to intervene prior to the occurrence of the genocide, right? So it's unique in this way. Most criminal statutes are intended to punish the perpetrator after the fact. The Genocide Convention criminalizes not only the act of genocide, but it also imposes affirmative obligations on state parties to the convention to act in order to prevent genocide from occurring whenever they learn that there's a credible risk that genocide is going to take place. So with this decision, all state parties to the convention, which I think are the vast majority, if not all states that are members of the UN, are now under a legal notice, under a legal obligation in international law, that they have to act to protect the Palestinian people from a substantial risk of genocide. I've lost you.
Yeah, we'll edit that out. So given it's, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So given what you've said, what have you made of Canada's decision? You are teaching in Toronto, and you're following Canadian politics and US policies. What have you made of Canada's position to say that they do not agree with the ICJ determination and they take a different position on that? And knowing that third parties need to intervene beforehand, what do you make of Canada's position?
Canada's position is very confused. A few weeks before the decision was announced, they said they rejected the premise of the case. And then there was a lot of pushback, and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, stated that accede to whatever decision the ICJ reached. Then, after the decision was announced, the Minister of Foreign Affairs again repeated this assertion that Canada rejected the premise of the case and announced a suspension in funding for UNRWA. On the other hand, when Canada announced that it had suspended funding for UNRWA, Canada didn't have any arrears payable to UNRWA. So it's not quite clear to what extent these announcements are posturing for domestic politics as opposed to genuine resistance to the decision. It's still unclear. It is very disappointing, however, to find any kind of rhetoric from the Canadian government, even if it's intended for domestic consumption, that would undermine public confidence in the decision or give the impression that Canada or any other country is free to second guess the decision of the ICJ. Any system of justice can only work if parties respect decisions, right? So there's a fundamental principle in all legal systems that whenever a court makes a decision, everybody is bound by that decision. You don't have the right to second guess the court's conclusion. That's why we have an adversarial process. South Africa brought its claim, it made its legal arguments, it presented its factual evidence. Israel showed up, disputed those claims, both on a legal basis and a factual basis, and the court made its ruling. Right. So there's been an adversarial process. There was a hearing. It was fair. Nobody is suggesting that it was unfair, that due process was violated. And then it made a decision by a vote of 15-2, by the way. It was overwhelming. It wasn't 9-8, for example. Right. By 15-2, they voted to indicate provisional measures. And so it's not appropriate for a state, a third-party state like Canada or the United States, to question the bindingness of such a decision. To question it is to undermine the very possibility of an international legal order.
So you mentioned 15-2 vote. Has that surprised you at all? The overwhelming...
It did, quite honestly. It did. I mean, I was discussing this case with a colleague of mine who's much more expert in public international law than I am. And he was expecting a very close decision, just based on the identities of the judges on the court. He was honestly expecting it to be 9-8 in favor of South Africa. And so we were all quite surprised that it was overwhelmingly in favor of South Africa. And that shows the strength of the case. And, you know, we've yet to see how this decision will play out in the Canadian legal system. But just a few days ago, we had a case in the United States in which Defense for Children Palestine brought a lawsuit in the United States District Court alleging that President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin were all in violation of their duties under the Genocide Convention. And that court had scheduled a hearing on that case, seeking a preliminary injunction, on the same Friday that the International Court of Justice issued its decision. So they held, this is in California, so the hearing occurred after the ICJ announced its decision. Now, the district court ended up dismissing the petition for a permanent injunction on purely technical jurisdictional grounds. The judge nevertheless went out of his way to affirm the legal and factual plausibility of genocide taking place in Gaza, and that the United States had an obligation to prevent that genocide. He felt powerless as a judge to do anything about it because of the limited nature of his jurisdiction. But he included direct appeals to President Biden to change his policy. And in fact, said everybody is under an obligation to confront the Israeli siege of Gaza. So I suspect that the ICJ decision is going to have substantial impact on the legal systems of many, many countries. So in Canada, for example, it's illegal to export weapons to a country that is engaged in, if it entails a substantial risk of committing human rights violations. So now there is a court, international court, the most prestigious international court, saying that Israel is plausibly engaged in genocide. How can Canada issue export licenses of arms to Israel given that finding? Right, to do so would be to violate Canadian domestic law. And then there are other provisions of domestic law in Canada and the United States and other democracies that will also be implicated. I think corporations will have to think very carefully about their business relationship with Israel, given this finding, right? So I think it will have dramatic effects, or it potentially could have dramatic effects.
Yeah, we hope so. Turning just to the university scene where you're teaching in Toronto, we've seen universities in the US, Canada, UK, and throughout Europe becoming really hostile environments, not just for students, but also for academics like yourself. How hard has it been for you as a professor in your ability to speak about Palestine and criticize Israel? What's the scene like in Toronto and Canada?
Well, I don't think it's welcoming. I'm not going to lie. It's certainly not welcoming. On the other hand, there are foolish people like myself who aren't easily deterred, and we continue speaking out. But it must be said that for people who don't enjoy tenure, for people who aren't necessarily senior in status, there are a lot of risks involved. And so there's a certain kind of discretion is the better part of valor in this context. So a lot of academics are scared of speaking up, particularly if they are untenured, graduate students, sessional instructors, etc. And that's one reason why somebody like myself, who is a professor, full professor, I don't have to worry about any other kind of promotions. There's nothing really I can be promoted to. I think it's very important that persons in my position speak up, not only for ourselves and Palestinians, but on behalf of countless others who are not free to speak.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Harvard University director losing her job because of the sheer amount of pressure that's been applied on her and various other institutions. And there's another dilemma that this has created for Muslims in particular and people generally who on the progressive side, who, with the election coming up in the US, elections here in the UK, they really are in a dilemma, especially in the US. How do you support a president who's more or less given a green light to genocide in Israel? I'm speaking about President Biden here, of course. But then on the other hand, you have someone who could be just as bad, if not worse, in the shape of Trump. So when people approach you and say, look, I don't know what to do in this kind of scenario, I'm in a moral predicament, I cannot vote for Biden. He just supported genocide. And at the same time, I can't vote for Trump. Trump represents all that's awful. He's even worse for Muslims and generally progressives and people on the left. What kind of advice, what do you say to people like that when they do face such moral quandary and dilemma?
Right. Well, I think that there's been a spontaneous decision by scores of people on the progressive left in the Democratic Party to abandon Biden because of his support, his unrestrained support for Israel. I think it's caused a lot of disgust among an important part of the Democratic coalition. And so my hope, I mean, I have to say this is more hope-based than evidence-based, is that responsible people in the Democratic Party are going to prevail on Biden and tell him, you are risking electoral catastrophe by this policy. And so the chief difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is that the Republicans aren't moved by genocide. I mean, lots of them are perfectly happy to see a genocide of the Palestinians, to be quite honest. Most Democrats find that to be, disgusting and intolerable. Problem that the leader of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, is out of touch with the rank and file of the party. And so I still have hope that there can be some dramatic changes in Biden's policy, not necessarily because he gets religion on this, but because, as I said, responsible people in the party are going to tell him, you have to change because it's going to matter to us in November at the ballot box. And I think we're seeing that in some small baby steps that the administration has already begun to take. And I'm mildly optimistic that they will be forced to take bolder steps. I mean, as I said, there was a lawsuit in California, even though the judge dismissed it, the judge explicitly writes in his order how sad he is that he cannot stop this and that the president must do something. And he is appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush. He's not even a Democratic appointee, right? So, God willing, there's a chance that there will be changes in U.S. policy.
Another conversation that a lot of people are having is the collapse of the world liberal order. And one of the arguments within that is that the West has always been the good guys and the rest of the world, or the global South generally, have been the bad guys. Are we seeing a shift in that, in your point of view? Because this has really questioned a lot of people's assessment of the moral claims made by the West and upon which the liberal order is based on. Do you think that story is now becoming undermined by their complicity and silence in Gaza?
Yeah. Before I answer that, there's one last thing I wanted to say. I forgot to say with respect to the previous question, is that because you asked us what should we be doing, and I guess what you meant by that was what should progressives, Muslims, Arabs who are citizens in liberal democracies like the United States and Canada, what should they be doing? They need to be pressuring, right? The center left parties in their countries to tell them, look, we cannot vote for you as long as you are complicit in genocide. We want to vote for you because we naturally are your supporters, but we cannot do that as long as you are complicit in genocide. And so we demand that you cease and desist from this policy as a price for our support. So you can't change things unless you actually make concrete demands. And so I think we have to be very explicit in telling our leaders that we are prepared to support them if they change, but if not, we will sit it out, right? Now, the second question you raised is a really important one. I'm not sure whether anybody really would have ever said that, liberal democracies are the good guys, the global South, the bad guys. I would have said more along the lines that you have democratic countries and you have authoritarian countries. Yes, maybe there's a larger incidence of democratic countries in the global North than in the global South and in the developing world for lots of complicated reasons. But as a general rule, we aspire to become democratic and prosperous. We don't aspire to become authoritarian kleptocracies. And I think that's very important to bear in mind, that our criticisms of countries like the United States and the UK and Canada is their rank hypocrisy and racism. It's not a criticism of democracy and human rights. What we are criticizing is their selectivity in promoting democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And so what we want is the universalization of democracy and human rights and progress. What we don't want is to undermine the achievements of democracy and human rights in order to strengthen authoritarianism and kleptocracy. So we have to be very careful in our critiques of the global north. That's my personal view, right? Some people that, the post-World War II order is irredeemable. I'm not one of those who believe that. I believe the problem in the post-world order is it hasn't fulfilled its own ideals, and that part of the political struggle is to universalize the ideals of democracy and human rights and not reserve them for an exclusive club of the global north.
So I guess what you're saying is that be careful wishing for a Chinese-led global system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Muslims should be the last ones cheering on the replacement of a US-led world order with a Chinese-led world order. I don't see how that could be particularly great for the global South. I also teach international business transactions. It's not as though China is a friendly creditor to the global South. They are very sharp in their dealings with debtor nations that they lend money to, etc. And so we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that a Chinese-led global order will necessarily be better for us.
On that, I mean, we have, of course, seen a lot of Chinese penetration into the region, in the Middle East. From an economic point of view, they have way more interaction and engagement dealings with the Middle Eastern countries than the US. It's replaced the US by a large margin. But looks like, given the backlash, given the response from the Houthis and attack on US bases, the war in Gaza could turn into a war to expel the US from the Middle East and to, as I said, erode the US-led liberal order. I mean, do you see that panning out? This could escalate and become a war to expel the US from the Middle East?
Well, I personally hope not, because I think, what we want is a progressive United States as a partner in the Middle East. I say that maybe because I'm an American and maybe I have rose-colored glasses when it comes to my country. But as I said, all things being equal, I much prefer the United States as a partner than China, for lots of reasons. And so what I feel is crucial is persuading the United States through a combination of, persuasion and also when required, resistance, that adopting a friendly posture toward the Middle East is much better for the United States, for the region, and for the world. And that entails promoting democracy, promoting development, promoting peace, promoting human rights, supporting authoritarianism, whether it's in the domestic governments of the Arab world or the despotism that Israel exercises over Palestinians. That's destructive for everybody, including the United States. And it does create opportunities for United States adversaries. So it's not really a rational policy from that perspective either. I think it would be catastrophic for the region if the United States withdrew entirely. If the United States withdrew entirely, then we would be simply open to unrestrained Israeli militarism, unrestrained intervention by the Russians, unrestrained intervention by the Chinese, and that can't further, what I want to see, which is democratization, rule of law, democracy, economic progress.
And we've seen what Russian intervention could look like, as we saw in Syria, and we're yet to see what Chinese intervention may look like. But US record, of course, leads many we can see that in front of us, and it's led many to believe that it can only be worse, but we've got nothing to compare it with, to be honest with you. We don't know what China will look like, and the ideals are not something we can judge at the moment. But on a final note, a lot of people have spoken about this as being a real hinge moment for them. They're re-evaluating the whole outlook, morally, philosophically, given how many so-called liberals in Western countries have just stood on the sideline, and they really see this as a transitional hinge moment in the way they look at the world. Has that been the case for you?
I don't know, because I've been so pessimistic for so long. I mean, I was expecting something catastrophic in Palestine sooner rather than later. I had told a colleague at another law school that this summer that it was the feel. I had the feeling it was like 1947 all over again. That it was a point that we had reached in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict where the Israelis were going to be very tempted to engage in some sort of cataclysmic campaign to try to, liquidate the Palestine issue, right? Through some sort of Nakba version 2, like they did in 1947, because of various reasons, not only because of the domestic politics in Israel becoming increasingly messianic, but also because the international situation seemed to be favorable, in that you had a very weak president in the United States in the form of Biden. You had conflict in Europe, and so there's a lot of distraction. And so the Israelis, I felt, were probably emboldened to think that they could take decisive steps against the Palestinians without fear, either of restraint from the United States or Europe, and certainly not the Arab world, because the Arab world is in a total state of disarray. And so all these factors, in my mind, had sort of coalesced in my mind to the conclusion that the ground was kind of ripe for some kind of massive campaign of ethnic cleansing on the Israeli part. I didn't know how it would take place, right? Oftentimes it requires a pretext, but I felt that, this is what they were hoping to be able to do, and October 7th gave them that pretext.
Thank you, Professor Fadel, for giving us your insight. We've come to the end of the show. I want to thank the viewers for joining another conversation with the Middle East Monitor with me, Naseem Ahmed. See you for another show next week. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.